Hey everybody, CyberTal back with you today, all things chess. We're finishing up our quick three-part tribute to Evgeny Sveshnikov. Of course, last week he passed away at the age of 71 from COVID-related complications. Please get vaccinated. We're finishing up our tribute with his sort of a quick discussion and example of his contributions to the advanced French. Personal story for myself: when I was growing up from when I started playing chess when I was 9 up to about 28, I think, is when I made the switch. I played e4 exclusively. My style used to be much different. I played 1e4. I was a very aggressive player. I played the open Sicilian, Perenni attack, all the super analyzed lines of the Sicilian. Now in my 30s, I play much differently. I play the English. I play the Taimanov from the black side. I play the Nimzo instead of the Grunfeld. Much more deliberative, but anyways. My repertoire against the French when I was growing up, when I first faced the French when I was 9 years old, I didn't know any theory, but I played 3e5, and this is the advanced French. I played this move sort of intuitively and instinctively, because I saw this bishop on c8, and I was thinking, well, let's make that bishop even worse. Let's just sort of entomb that bishop in, grab more space, take the f6 square away from this knight. It seemed quite good. Now, the history of this move, Aaron Nimzovich had a huge debate with Siegbert Tarash over this. Nimzovich took the side of 3e5. When you go back and read his seminal book, My System, a whole lot of the book is just dedicated to studying positions that come from the advanced French, because a lot of his theories of central overprotection, piece maneuvers, using pieces to control the center instead of pawns, stuff like that, first came from examining the advanced French. This move was sort of the spark for him setting a lot of his hypermodern ideas into action. And then Tarash came along and took the contrary position. He said that e5 was a positional mistake, and then they had a couple of high-profile games with Nimzovich on the white side of the advanced French against Tarash. Now we know that they're both correct in their own way. The advanced French is just another perfectly valid way of playing against the French. It's just different. But when Nimzovich first introduced this in the teens and 20s, it had a little bit of a popularity streak, but really, the most popular moves against the French have always been knight c3. That's the most popular. And then you play e5 only after, say, bishop b4 or knight f6. Those are the two main moves against knight c3. Or, of course, knight d2. This is called the Tarash against the French. This is the move that Tarash advocated against the French instead of 3e5. Knight d2, it's a little bit worse for wear nowadays. Black seems very comfortable, so knight c3 is really taken over as the main line. But e5 is sort of always hung around in the background as a possibility, but not really an incredibly dangerous try against the French. Sveshnikov, coming in the 70s and 80s, he did a lot of theoretical work in this opening, but also a lot of personal praxis. The most impressive thing about Sveshnikov is that he dedicated his work into his own play. He didn't just hang out in the background throwing out theory and then playing other moves when it came to actually sit down at the board. He really put his theory where his mouth was. He getting a lot of high-profile and impressive wins with the advanced French, and that sort of spurred a renaissance in that. So when I played this 3e5 move instinctively when I was young, when I didn't know any theory, but once I started getting serious about chess and learning theory, it was a lot of Sveshnikov's analysis in games that I looked at to grow to understand the advanced French. So a lot of my good personal memories of Evgeny Sveshnikov are just learning so much about the advanced French from him and getting a lot of good games and good positions from his hard work. So that's my own personal thank you to Evgeny Sveshnikov for all the good attacking wins I had as a kid when I was white playing against the French. Rest in peace. So this is a tribute game that we're showing today. This is his game against Boris Zlotnik from the Moscow 1991. E5, C5. This is the classical move. When you look at Nimzovich's My System, a lot of it is discussion of how to attack pawn chains. And his main recommendation is that you attack the base of the pawn chain. And that's exactly what c5 does. It's attacking that key d4 pawn, which is the main support for e5. So the idea is, if you take out the base, then the e5 pawn is just as likely to fall as anything else. Modern chess theory sort of questions the dogma of this. It's sort of ironic that Nimzovich was challenging dogma, but in its own way it became a dogma in itself. There are just as many times where it's perfectly valid to play a move like f6 to attack the front of the pawn chain rather than the base. And you see that in a lot of French positions in general. But in general, you want to be playing pawn breaks. Pawn breaks, if I emphasize one thing in these analytical videos that we do, pawn breaks are the engines of your play. Always be looking for pawn breaks. So Black's pawn breaks here are c5 and f6. Both those moves are very important for Black. Those are moves that he needs to be looking at basically every move to see if those are valid ways of going forward. Those are really the main ways that you generate play and counterplay and generate activity in position. So c5, it's a logical pawn break in this position. c3, also logical, supports the pawn on d4. Knight c6, another way of going about it. Bishop d7. When I was playing the advanced French, I thought this was the most troublesome. Generally, this bishop on f1, White's light square bishop, is going to be the most dangerous attacking piece on the board. So Black immediately generates a plan to remove that piece from the board. It might not necessarily be better or worse than other ways, but I think this is the most annoying. It forces White to be happy with a small positional plus resulting from an edge in space, rather than any sort of interesting attacking ideas. Because once that light square bishop is gone, a lot of White's dynamism disappears with it, so he just has to be happy with the positional features of the position. Again, not necessarily better or worse, just a different way. So knight c6, natural move. Bishop d7, the classical way of playing is queen b6. This has sort of gone out of favor nowadays because of the modern move of a3. Previously, back in Nimzovich's day, bishop e2 would be played without thinking. And then bishop d3. This is responsible for a very famous game from Nimzovich against Salve, and I believe it was 1911, where Salve played the positional mistake of bishop d7, whereas after dx c5, White's doing fine. But after takes, then bishop d7, now White has the uncomfortable position of moving this bishop again to support the d-pawn, or playing castle. Now this is a gambit. This is called the Milner-Berry, but it's really not great for White. Modern theory gives Black an edge without really any problems at all. But really, the modern main line of a3 is why queen b6 has gone a little bit out of favor. White's going to play on b4 to take that pressure off the d-pawn. It resolves the tension in the center. Also gives this dark square bishop the square of b2 to help support that pawn on d4. I think White's always a little bit better in these positions. I think these are very comfortable. Bishop d7 is a little bit more flexible, which I think it is a little bit better move than queen b6. So bishop e2, this is the normal move. a3 is a little bit less appropriate here. It's more appropriate with queen on b6. Now, there's no queen on b6. a3 is a little bit worse, in my opinion. So f6, again, pawn breaks are what you want to be looking at here. It seems like to me f6 is the most appropriate because you're generating maximum pressure against White's center. Bishop d3, knight e6. This is another very common French move. Again, the junk about the knight on the rim being grim is just complete junk. Then the knight will be very well placed on f7, generating pressure against that e5 pawn. And notice that if White takes, I actually prefer Black here. Black has the bishop pair. That's a huge asset in most positions. But you can see that early pawn break with f6, it's already gotten rid of one of White's central bastions. And this bastion on d4 is already under threat of being liquidated. This is a great position for Black. Instead of taking, probably most appropriate would be castle. And this is going to be a normal position. And this is going to be a very fun fight to come. Bishop e2, in my opinion, it's a little bit better just because you're getting on with the business of development. So knight ge7, knight a3. For people that don't play the advanced French, this might seem like a truly bizarre move. The main point of this move, it sort of ties in with Nimzovich's idea of overprotection. This knight is headed to the boring-looking post of c2, where it's going to help overprotect this pawn on d4. Now, that knight is going to be quite passive on c2. Absolutely. That's not going to be your best piece at all. But the fact that it's helping protect the pawn on d4 allows you to improve some of your other pieces. And this knight really doesn't have a good post to begin with. Now that this pawn's in c3, it can't hop to c3 anymore, so d2 is not really a great post. That really leaves a3, and on c2 it's passive, but at least it's doing something positive, where white can improve his other pieces. So this, a good choice. cd, knight c2, knight b4. This is a little bit profligate with time. Black's going out of his way to trade this knight on c2 off, but it's basically a one-for-one trade, because you're getting rid of one of the defenders of d4, but that knight on c6 was an attacker of d4, so it equals out, and black is the one spending time to accomplish this. Queen b6, in my opinion, is better. Castle. And the advanced French player in me thinks that this is a great position for white. Objectively, I think this is just a normal French position with a good fight to come. Notice here, this is a blunder. Just outright loses a piece. These indirect tactical ways of guarding the d4 pawn are sort of why the advanced French is viable at all. And Sveshnikov is actually responsible for discovering a lot of those indirect tactical threats. Without those indirect tactical threats to help defend d4, I think the advanced French would just be unsound, because there's so many of these indirect tactical schemes that make all these lines work for white. So knight b4, in my opinion, just too impractical, too profligate with time. Castle. And again, black spent all this time moving to trade that knight on c2 off, but white's just continued getting development. Here, I do think white's a little bit better. He's got this nice central edge. This pawn on e5 is a nice wedge for any sort of kingside attack. Black hasn't generated any counterplay against the center so far. So black's solid, but he's definitely a little bit worse. a6. Rook c8, in my opinion, is a little bit better. a6 in a lot of lines. The queen being undefended on b6 actually matters. To h5, this is very normal in these positions. Black is stopping g4 from being played, which would knock this well-placed knight on f5 away. That's very normal for the structure. Notice that bishop b5 doesn't work because of queen b3. And again, this queen being undefended on b6 matters. So h5, very normal for the structure, prevents g4. a4, this is just sort of a nice general squeezing move. It gains space on the queen side, prevents bishop b5 permanently. a5 prevents a5. Rook fd1, bishop c3 is a little bit better in my opinion. We don't yet know where either of these rooks really belong. It's probably the case that this rook should go to b1 to support the b4 push, but we don't yet know that. So rook fd1, it doesn't change the position, so white keeps his edge simply for static positional means, but we don't know if this rook's going to be good on d1 or not. Bishop e7, h3. Some lines, this will help prepare g4 for white himself. Some lines, it prevents g5, g4 from black. Just depends. Bishop c3, h4. This is, in my opinion, this is the last positional mistake from black. After this, I think black is just positionally lost. In a lot of these positions, g5, g4 is sort of one of black's positional trumps that he can look to gain counterplay, because it forces this knight on f3 away, which weakens this d4 pawn. Without that g5, g4, black doesn't have any pawn breaks here. So without any pawn breaks, the only positional feature that matters in the position is white's edge in space, and also the relative weakness of this a5 pawn, but mostly white's edge in space. So yeah, I think h4 is just a dire positional error. It removes black's last vestige of play from the position. From this point on, it's just white squeezing without having to worry about any blowback from black. Queen d2 pressures the a5 pawn, looks at the g5 square, good move. Rook db1. So we see that the rook fd1 was a sort of a waste of time, but it's a closed position, so a waste of time doesn't matter as much. When a position's closed up like this without any pawn breaks, you can maneuver your pieces a little bit more fluidly without having to worry about tempo concerns. But here, the rook comes to b1 to support the b4 push. Very, very logical. Bishop b4, bishop b5. This is Sveshnikov's only error of the game, and this takes it close to equal pretty much immediately. King h1 is better. Just slowly improving and waiting for black to commit to something. When you have a positional edge in a position like this where things are closed up, your opponent doesn't have any pawn breaks, doesn't have any counterplay, don't rush anything. Just slowly improve everything. The king comes to h1 to take its way, get out of the range of any random suicide checks from black. The bishop comes to d3 because that's where it belongs. It's better placed there. Also threatening to damage black's pawn structure, potentially. But otherwise, white can just slowly build. He can bring his rook to c1 to challenge for the c-file. White's in no rush here. There's no reason to commit to anything incendiary, because white's the one that has the advantage, and black has no counterplay to challenge it. It's the positions where tempo is a concern that you do want to rush. If you have a temporary advantage in like initiative, or your opponent's king is still stuck in the center for the next 2 or 3 moves, you've got that small window where you just need to blast ahead at all costs, just all-out suicide rush. In a slow close-up position like this, where you have an advantage in space, that's a permanent edge. You don't have to worry about that advantage disappearing. You can play deliberately. You can just slowly build up and maneuver. Bishop e5 is a hasty move. It gives away all of white's advantage in a situation where he doesn't have to rush like this. So bishop x b5, bishop x b4, bishop d7. This gives the advantage right back to white, and this bishop is an absolute monster. It's going to be devouring all these strong dark squares on the black side of the board. Normal would just be AB, and he probably, I'm guessing Zlotnik didn't play this because he saw this pin and didn't care for it, but after queen a6, this is clearly fine. AB, if the queen takes, it's king d7. White's up a pawn, but not really. I mean, his extra pawn's on b5. There's no way to generate a pass pawn from that extra pawn, so material is more or less equal, and this is a completely drawn position. There's no way for white to make progress here. But on AB, now, this is still complex. You know, it's a queen versus 2 rooks. I can see some situations where the queen sort of maneuvers to get pressure on this b-pawn, or somehow slips over to the king side at the right time to generate pressure. But this should be balanced. Black can always try to generate counterplay by slipping his rook to the back rank, or his other rook to the back rank. But after bishop d7, again, this is just going back to a situation where white has a free advantage. This bishop is just going to absolutely crush black. And white still has this crushing edge in space because of this pawn on e5, which is the trump that he gained by playing e5 on move 3. So bishop c5, and then b4. Again, always look to your pawn breaks. You want to be looking to pawn breaks to open things up and generate play. b4 is white's pawn break. So he gets it in where both his rooks are perfectly poised to generate that pawn break. So b6 challenging the bishop. Bishop d6, of course, is natural. I just give this as an example. This is a mistake for white, but I actually think white is still better. These 2 pass pawns are incredibly strong, but there's no reason to play this. Bishop d6 is natural and winning. f6 is if the knight takes. Queen f4. And white's advantage is absolutely crushing. This pawn on d6 is worth a minor piece. This rook is just going to come to the c-file and land on c7. Black's king is in very dire straits. This is a winning edge for white. White can just slowly choke black to death, and there's nothing black can do, because black doesn't have any counterplay. There's nothing for black to do in this position that's positive. f6, rook c1, taking first is a little bit more accurate. Just a small move order thing, but it doesn't change the... Again, white holds all the positional trumps here. He's got the edge in space. He dominates the dark squares. These are permanent positional features. He doesn't have to worry about... It's not like an edge in initiative or an edge in time or an edge in development that's going to disappear at some point. These are permanent features of the position. White can just slowly build. There's no counterplay for black. White doesn't have to worry about rushing. He can just slowly build up and strangle black to death. b5, again, gaining the c6, or taking the c6 square away, gaining even more space. Excellent choice. Rook a3, the rook can come to c3 or e3, depending, most likely c3. Now it's threatening to land on c7. Just in time, so black doesn't have time to take on d6 because the rook hangs. Rook c8. Again, perfect tempo play, hitting that bishop on e8. And then this would absolutely make Nimzovich proud. For those of you who are lovers of chess history, go find Nimzovich-Samish. I think it was 1923. I forget the town. But it's the immortal Zugzwang game, where Nimzovich was black in the game. Samish was white. So Samish-Nimzovich. But basically on a board full of pieces, I think only one minor piece and one set of pawns were traded off. But basically in a full board, Nimzovich just completely strangled Samish to death, where Samish literally couldn't move. There's still plenty of material on the board here. You know, 2 rooks, set of queens, set of minor pieces, more or less all the pawns, and yet black can hardly move. This is an absolutely gorgeous Zugzwang from Sveshnikov. And it's sort of the rallying cry of the e5 variation in general. You know, white plays e5 in the hopes of gaining extra space and slowly choking black to death with that space. This is sort of a perfect avatar of that philosophy. Rook f8, queen c2, threatening some rank takeover. And here black resigns. You know, the queen can't move because the mate on h7, but all I can do is give the queen up and then lose a little bit later. So, model games from Sveshnikov, he was really the impetus behind a renaissance in the advanced French. Before his work had really started to become a slightly fallow variation. You know, all the research was being done on the knight c3 and knight d2 lines. But he really forged this into a really powerful weapon, and it's still reasonably popular today. Not as popular as knight c3, but as theory continues to increase in the Vinovar and the Steinitz variations, the advance will always be around just because it doesn't have nearly as much theory, but it's still positionally sound for white. So white can play it with confidence to try to get something off the theory books and just play a game of chess where he can try to use his edge in space to gain something palpable. So that concludes our sort of miniature tribute to Evgeny Sveshnikov. He will be dearly missed. He is one of the most important figures in modern chess theory. I think it was Mark Tymanoff that said that him discovering or creating the Sveshnikov variation, also called the Chelyabinsk, was the last great modern opening discovery. Just because it is so rare to create an entire new opening that's played by virtually everyone on move 5. That's just impossible to do in modern chess. But Sveshnikov's work, along with Timoshenko, he accomplished that. And his work in the C3 Sicilian, the advanced French, incomparable. Both those lines could easily be called the Sveshnikov without really anyone disagreeing, I think. But also the fact that he was able to put all these openings into practice with his own strength. He was a very strong player in his own right. He wasn't just a theoretician. His results in his theory are just incredible, and he really left his stone in the cairn of modern chess. So, Goodspeed Sveshnikov, you will be missed. Tomorrow we're going to be going back to work on hanging pawns. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.